Hi everybody, it's Matt Robinson. Welcome to another edition of the Writer's Block. The world recently celebrated, or at least marked, the 80th anniversary of World War II. And while war is never a good thing, a lot of great technologies and great people and great stories have come out of it. We're going to be focusing about one of those stories today with our friend and neighbor, Doug Hall. Doug is a historian who recently wrote an amazing book about his grandfather, who came up with some of the major developments of World War II that we still use today. So it's a real, this is admittedly been one of my favorite books that I've been able to talk about, and it's a real thrill to finally have you here, Doug. Welcome to the show.
Well, thank you so much, Matt. I just so appreciate the opportunity to have a chance to talk a little bit about my grandfather and as it relates to the story that I researched and found an incredible journey and enjoying having the opportunity to share it.
Thank you. So you have a background in museum studies and history. How did that interest first start, and then how did that lead into what skills from that background served you well in producing the book?
Well, I would first come to the book through an interest in my grandfather with bits of information that was passed on to me by my father, but there was very little concrete information. So I found that in time I was able to request and receive the full military record of my grandfather, and at that point I knew I had a story, and up to that point it was really broken up snippets of information on the internet and in military books, etc. So with my background, as you mentioned, in museum studies, naturally I have some archival skills, research skills, library skills, etc. So this was a natural transition to use some of those skills to research first and then be able to tell the story.
Let's go into a brief biography just so we know the great man we're talking about.
Sure, this is always a challenge because part of what made this so exciting was there were so many chapters in his life, as you will see in the book. He will begin his career as a pilot as a bomber pilot in World War I. That will be a period of time in which he will, in fact, be in combat in the sky, and he will also have shot down 3 German airplanes in the process. Coming back from that experience, he's going to dovetail into what becomes the airmail service, which people take for granted that the commercial airplane was just developed for the sake of developing. It wasn't. The government had decided that airmail service was possible, and it looked for financiers, capitalists, plane designers, and pilots such as my grandfather to begin the process of building a reliable airmail service plane. Jumping from there, he is going to leave that world with financing knowledge, capitalization knowledge, and other self-taught skills and land in Wall Street. And the connection there, which might seem separated, is that the airmail system carried enormous amounts of bond notes, stock notes, treasury notes, etc., that gave the stock market and the operators on the stock market the opportunity to turn around those notes in what used to be a week or two, turn them around in 48 to 72 hours. So he landed with that knowledge, succeeded on the exchange, became a member of the New York Stock Exchange, and also opened a brokerage. Stock market would crash literally 2 years after he started. He would move on. Then he's going to return to what became city-to-city route competition, whereby pre-commercial airlines, of which Howard Hughes was getting involved with TWA, and then others were getting involved with other namesakes of airlines you would know, running route to route, Chicago to New York. Who's got the fastest time? James Hall or Jimmy Doolittle or Captain Frank Hawks. This will be a very intense period of time, and all these times are very compressed. He'll leave that opportunity and join in marriage and in relationship a woman who owned an enormous ranch property in Texas. He would then pursue developing the American quarter horse and making it an official racing breed. Then his life will be interrupted again with another war. World War II will begin. He'll take on what I guess would describe as his largest role. He will step into World War II and become the driver and the developer of photo reconnaissance, which is the reconnaissance that is mapping and photographing Nazi Germany occupied Europe to bring detail back to the bombers. And he will eventually become responsible for mapping the coast of Normandy for the D-Day invasion. So I'm sorry, that's as quickly as I can cover it all.
Well, it's quite a story. Why do you think that you were the first to tell it to such a degree?
Well, I have an anecdote for that, but basically I think within a family, there's only going to be generally one or two people that are interested enough in the ancestry of their parents or the ancestry of their grandparents. His trail, fortunately, was there, but it was in bits and pieces. So nobody had written a book about his life. I could find references, significant references, chapters of information on his contributions, particularly in World War II. Then with newspapers.com, a much broader sense, and all these chapters started to fill in a bit about his different activities. So why wasn't a single volume book written on his life? In a sense, I'm glad one wasn't, because I had the opportunity to research his life and learn about him and produce it. And the anecdote I remember succinctly is when I began this process and got the military service record of his, which was almost as thick as a Webster dictionary. I was in Chicago and I went to a military library in Chicago and I sat down with a military librarian. I wanted to ask him some questions and he said, "Show me what you have." And I said, "Well, I have a military service record here and some other notes," and passed it to him, and he flipped through it. Took a minute and he said, "So, you are the one that has come to this collection. You are the one that in your family, I'm going to guess, is going to be the only one that's going to take the time to research this book and write it." And he said, "You have a story to tell, so go tell it."
Were you able to reach out to other members of your family for their stories and information?
Yeah, interesting enough, in my immediate family, because my father unfortunately would not be able to grow up with my grandfather, James Goodwin Hall, we only had snippets of information. So this is what happens, hopefully, for those that are interested in researching somebody in their lives. I landed in a gold mine by turning over as many proverbial leaves as I could. We have a first cousin in Texas, Wendy Grimes. I had not ever met her except for one moment in my life, so it really doesn't count. It was a short intersection. Wrote her an introductory letter, sent it to her saying, "I'm writing a book about our grandfather." And lo and behold, she has the motherlode of collection. She has the memorabilia, she has the letters, she has the photographs, she has the portraits, she has correspondence, she has the dog tags that he wore in World War I. So you can imagine when I got the text and she's saying, in the text she said, "Jackpot." And then she showed me like about 16 images of what she had. And so to answer your question, you got to keep on turning over those leaves, and you never know what you're going to find. But she is the singular source for a very significant part of illustrating his life.
Having your background in museum work, are you interested at all in making something of that collection, some sort of traveling exhibit or something, like a tribute to your grandfather, or just to show how his this multifaceted, fascinating life contributed to not only the war effort, but all these other facets?
Yeah, that's a very good question, Matt, and you've made me turn some wheels now, and I hadn't thought about that. Certainly that could be an opportunity, and certainly I might pursue that. I have to, I guess, as you do later in life, walk carefully with somebody who was a stranger up until literally a year ago, who's actually my first cousin. and find whether or not there's any receptiveness on her part. Certainly I want to go visit the physical collection, and maybe that's the time to broach the question, is when we're there physically looking at the collection and suggesting that. It's a wonderful idea. Thank you for mentioning that.
What new or what different tools or techniques in the actual research did you use that maybe you hadn't used before in other parts of your career?
I found, I guess, primarily subscription databases. I didn't realize how well developed newspapers.com was. If anybody listening is interested in starting their search, first of all, you'll want to use ancestry.com, and then for detail, locally, regionally, nationally, internationally, newspapers.com is going to find a source for you. So what I learned was I sought out all sorts of different databases, military databases, library databases, and then the more commercial databases. And as my wife can tell you, who lived through this whole 6 years of research and experience and was very supportive, but at times heard my complaints, I subscribed to one lesser known newspaper database and complained about it at first as I was sifting through it, and then I spent a day with it and learned how to use the search engine. It came up with all sorts of amazing surprises that newspapers.com did not have, which led me down actually one entire chapter. So yes, all those tools you have to self-learn, and you again should shoot for a wider base of search tools as opposed to a narrow base of search tools.
Right. What are some of the, were there stories that were left on the cutting room floor? Were there anecdotes that you heard or people you were hoping to reach that you couldn't?
Yeah, I mean, time has gone by, and those that were a part of his life have passed away. I was hoping for possibly a connection with a relative of one of the pilots that flew under him in one of his squadrons. And I'm going to pursue that a little bit further. I have letters that are in the book, 3 letters in particular from 3 pilots that flew under him on the 13th Squadron Photo Reconnaissance Group. And I recently just sent a book out to their address. So I'm hoping that over time, as I start the promotional and marketing aspect of this book, that I'm going to be able to reach out and connect with some people that may have been a part of his past, at least in a secondary way, that next generation that can tell me maybe more of a oral or maybe share some other written information.
In terms of the process, again, you mentioned that there was a little initial frustration with one of the databases. Were there any other points at which you were kind of stopped short and not sure whether to continue?
I guess there's a part of me that stepped away from the work and saw it as quite dry with too many facts and figures and not really a narrative. And so that point was a little bit frustrating because I didn't know how to get over that hump, as it were. And that's where an editor helped enormously. An experienced historian and editor and author who was remarkable, Jennifer Hollick, who's available on the internet. She's a special enabler. And she was hard, and she made me turn the book away from facts and figures and into a narrative. So that was a block that I had. As you mentioned, was there a point in time where you stopped and said, I'm not going to be able to go any further with this? I looked at it and she said, you want this to be readable, right? I said, okay, I get it. Okay, you want people to read the book, right? Well, yeah. So she said, so you're going to have to go back and create a narrative. And you don't have a narrative right now. So you're going to have to work on that, and we can work on it together. So.
Yeah, I mean, we having supportive colleagues in our line of work is always important. Speaking of colleagues, you mentioned that your grandfather worked with Howard Hughes. Were there any other interesting characters who came across the transom during your research?
There's always, it seems, a variety of intersections, because really, in that world of piloting and commercial development, you are interchanging with individuals who are celebrities in the newspaper, because aviation is the beginning, is like astronauts in our lifetime, really, because people thought of this as both very dangerous and very exciting and thrilling, and thought of it as a competition sport in the sky, right? So one anecdote, here's a story with an intersection with Lindbergh, which was again thanks to the newspapers.com database. He's working on setting another route record from New York to Ottawa, Canada. Who should also be landing at that same airport during that same hour on his way to go halfway around the world to the Orient with his wife is Charles Lindbergh, which, I mean, we read the account of that today is unbelievable, with as many stops and as many harrowing experiences. So he's landing his plane, and his plane looks a lot like Lindbergh's plane. The crowds are coming out to the plane. He's looking around. He gets out of the plane, and his mechanic gets out of the plane. There's two people, Mr. and Mrs., and he gets down to the tarmac, and they realize, wrong guy. But anyway, he's very happy to have had the attention he had, and that afternoon he met Lindbergh face to face at the airport as they were getting ready to start this incredible adventure to fly the first airplane through and around the Orient and return alive.
Which is a good way to return. So in addition to starting these technologies and developing the quarter horse and being basically kind of at the beginning of the stock market, there was also just sort of what else was going on in the world that he was involved with?
Well, I'm going to say that these chapters that I break out into seem to be somewhat sequenced, and they are, but there's overlap, of course. While he's on Wall Street, he's beginning to fly commercial routes at the same time. He's racing motorboats and sailboats in San Diego Bay, and he's also racing horses in horse shows and jumping shows. So even though I have to capture one chapter, there is, as you point out, a lot going on in his life all the time. And one particular example is that during the period of time where he's in these route-to-route competitions, late 20s, early 30s, you have prohibition. So he's going to be an advertisement for repealing prohibition, and he's going to join an organization called the Crusaders, and I have pictures of his plane in my book where he's got a banner across the fuselage and saying repeal prohibition. So you're right, all these integrated activities are occurring around him at the same time.
And in addition, there seems to be a parallel arc with the history of aviation, because he really started with the very nascent propeller planes and then was able to live into the jet age.
Right, right. And that, I think, was very important for him, because I think ultimately his passion in life was flying and the advancement of flight. And yes, he did remark at the end of his career that he had seen the advent of the airplane from the propeller and the biplane wing to the beginning of jet propulsion, which we of course take for granted now. But jet propulsion was just developed and being used at the very end of World War II, both successfully by Germany and by the Allies. And I know through, fortunately, letters that I've seen snippets of, he had a daughter as well as a son, which was my father. And his daughter he was extremely close with, and at times he did have an opportunity to bring her to the air base in World War II. And there are pictures in the book of that event. So leading to your question, in one of the slides I have, which are quotes of him that I received from my first cousin, from the letter he wrote his daughter, he said, "I want you to be aware that, and maybe proud, that your father, in that case, myself, will have flown a propeller plane in World War I, and I've gotten access to fly a prototype jet propulsion plane.
And that was Hughes's plane, right?
I believe it was Hughes's plane, his prototype plane, which Hughes later crashed and nearly died in.
But your grandfather didn't.
Fortunately not.
It went up on Howard Hughes.
Went up on Howard Hughes, yes. So.
Now, as a writer, how has producing a book, if at all, changed your approach to writing? Because I know you also have a podcast on jazz and you write articles. So we kind of kindred spirits in that way. So I'm fascinated to find out how you feel your style, your process, things of that sort have changed before and after producing the book.
Good question. I think with writing jazz reviews about music, again, what I've learned is the lesson taught to me by the editor, Jennifer Hollick, that says facts and figures don't work. You have to tell a narrative. So if you have the story of Dizzy Gillespie or the story of Duke Ellington, there are 300 books on each person's lives. So what is your angle? Where are you going to go with that? You can find an original voice. I mean, you don't have to just use quotes and material. So I think this process helps me realize that whatever you're writing, as you and I are writers, telling a story about factual information, you have to make it a narrative. You have to engage the audience and tell them something maybe new or different, or approach it with a different angle. So I think the writing of this book has helped that process to get away from the facts and figures and to tell the story.
But also with this book, it was the first of its kind, so you had a little more leeway as far as
I had a lot more leeway.
Not having to retread something.
Right, and fortunately I wasn't impacted by somebody else, because as you know, you can as a writer, you're interested in a subject and then somebody's written the book and you read it and then you think, well, what could I possibly add?
Right.
So I had the opportunity to explore with no risk factor, because nobody was going to come back and say, oh, that's not true, because I'd say, you have no idea, because nobody else has done the research for this book that I have. So I happen to have it verified. So yeah, so those are important considerations. In many ways, as you've just mentioned, I feel extremely fortunate now, as one of your questions was earlier, why hasn't a book been written? Well, selfishly, thankfully, one hasn't, because it forced me down the road to take the journey to learn about my grandfather.
Right.
So
now that you've gone through the process, are there other people that have long fascinated you that you might want to pursue a similar path?
Well, I mean, I have certainly a grandfather on my mother's side of the family that had a very interesting and an exciting life, not at sort of the pace and adventure of this man, but I know that it's, as you know as a writer, it's a bug after you write your first book or second, and that you want to move on and you want to research and you want to start another direction with maybe telling another story through a publication. So I think once I have more time spent promoting my current book, that's a thought process I'm going to go through. Yeah.
What would you recommend for people who might have someone in their life who might be of interest to others about starting the process and overcoming the obstacles and following in your footsteps, as it were?
I would really recommend that people pursue it because, first of all, with the databases and internet, there are enormous resources to find even specks of information about people from a local level, regional and national level. And it is a story that, for those to tell who are interested in it, and in a larger extended family, there's generally one or two people that have the skill and desire to do the research and the writing involved. And what you come out with is a history that was lost that you've now told. So otherwise, it will go, in a sense, it will go away. But if you have that inclination, I highly recommend it. It's a very rewarding experience and an incredible personal journey to take. And in the end, you've rescued history about some aspect of a person in your family's life.
Well, I'm very glad you wrote this book, and very glad you could join us on the show, and very glad you folks could join us too. We hope to see you next time on The Writer's Block. you.